Tests. I hate tests. I'm pretty sure you hate tests. I think we all hate taking tests. And a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact we live in a world where tests are all about whether we're good enough or not. And in fact, if you notice, some tests seem like they're even designed to make it difficult to pass. It's like they want you to fail. But what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to help us recognize that God has a whole different perspective. And by the end of this, hopefully, while we may not love taking a test, help us to recognize what it takes to pass the test. And in doing so, that's what propels us forward into our destiny. That's the thing that releases God's power in our life and in the circumstances we face. So to do so, I want to look at a story that in my mind is the most painful test, most painful challenge anybody faced in the Bible except Jesus going to the cross. More painful than David on the run for years, more painful and difficult than Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego going into the fiery furnace. And that's in Genesis 22. And in Genesis 22, God goes to Abraham and says, I want you to sacrifice your son, your only son, the son you love. Imagine how painful that was even to hear it. When God says, I want you to sacrifice your son. But there's some things we can learn here, okay? Now, first off, before we go any further, I want to point out, the New Living Translation says it this way. It says, God tested Abraham's faith. See, God wasn't testing Abraham. This was not about whether Abraham was good enough or not. What God was testing was his faith. And when we go through a trial, when we go through a test, what's on trial, what's being tested is not us. It's our faith. And we're going to come back to that and why God fully expects and intends for us to pass that test. So again, God is testing Abraham's faith. But one of the first things we need to recognize is this. Abraham could have easily said, oh, hold on, God, I don't understand. You promised the son to me. Yes, I love him, but Father God, you gave him to me miraculously. See, Abraham could have got up in the why God debate, trying to understand why I'm going through this test. Now, let me say, I probably do it more than any of you do. I'm probably the world's worst at it. But you know, what happens is when we get caught up in just trying to understand why we're in the test, in the trial, in the challenge, all we do is wind up frustrating ourselves. We're not getting the clarification we think we need because that's not what's important. And we wind up spinning our wheels. Rather, do what Abraham did. So while he could have easily questioned God, why? I don't understand. God, you gave me this son. We don't see any of that. What do we see? We see him get up the next morning, pack up, and go. See, God had told him to go to Mount Moriah, which is a 3-day journey away, to sacrifice his son. And so what did Abraham do? He didn't debate. He didn't grapple with understanding. He simply responded. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole that it was a 3-day journey to Mount Moriah and Jesus was in the tomb 3 days. All we can say is this. For 3 days, Abraham was journeying to Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son with heartache. I think we really would all believe he's doing so with heartache, right? He has no idea how this is going to wind up. But what did he do? He just responded. You know, this is, I think, one of the reasons why Abraham was called a friend of God. He didn't debate, but in spite of the heartache, he simply responded. Now, I said earlier that God has a whole different perspective on our test, and we're going to come back to the story with Abraham. But, you know, if we look in 1 Peter 1:7, it talks about the testing of our faith, this more precious than gold. And I want us to look at that word for testing. See, we think of a test as, is it good enough? But rather, the word testing there means to prove that the your faith is being proven. Let's change our perspective. See, Abraham's faith, it says God was testing Abraham's faith. What does it mean? He was proving Abraham's faith. God knew he was going to pass the test. God knew he was going to respond. See, when you or I, in the test or in the trial, and this applies whether that test was God initiated, like with Abraham, or whether circumstances of living in a fallen world that have gotten us. God intends for us to pass the test. Why? Because he's not testing our faith, he's proving our faith. Now, one more thing as we look at it. It says, our faith, which is more precious than gold. See, how do you prove gold? Well, you refine it. And as you heat it up and refine it, which is uncomfortable, you prove that it's genuine, but you also, in the process, you eliminate more of the impurities. It gets better. See, when our faith is proven, it's refined. And while it may be painful in the short term, what happens? By being proven and refined, our faith grows stronger. So coming back to the story, Abraham's faith is being proven, and we see it now by a couple of things. First off, they're at Mount Moriah, and he says to the servants who've come with him, we will go up to worship God, and we will be back. Now, how did he have the faith? I don't know. But you know what it says in Hebrews? It says he reasoned that even if God had to raise him from the dead, his faith was somehow, some way, I'm going to sacrifice my son, but somehow, some way, God's going to give him back to me. And they went up to the mountain, and they get up there, and his son turns to him and says, where is the sacrifice? Now imagine, Abraham's getting ready to tie him up and lay him on the altar. And Abraham says one more thing I think is really important to him. He says, God will provide. See, again, what we don't see is Abraham working out how. Just that confidence that God had the answer. And by Abraham responding and going through the entire, and this was not a formality. Abraham had to be fully committed. But when he did, God stopped him and said, yeah, I see your faith. And God did provide the sacrifice. See, we don't need to know, although we think we do, when you're facing the challenge, when you're in the trial, whatever it is, the secret to a God-powered life and living God-powered is getting beyond the reasoning and just that pure faith that, God, I have no idea how, but you have the answer. And even if you have to resurrect some of these circumstances from the dead, you're going to do it. The secret to a God-powered life is when we're in the trial, it's our faith being proven, and our faith will get stronger. Don't look at the circumstances. Look at the Father God and our faith.